The measure of intelligence is the ability to change. Hi all, I'm Dr. Clark, and this is the introductory lecture to current issues. So, before we get into current issues in biology in today's society, we have to cover some basics. You have to understand some of the precursors to be able to learn about what's going on today. And those precursors would be some of the biological themes. You got to learn about cells. You got to learn about energy, learn about heredity, genetics, evolution. Once we have a grasp on those concepts, then we'll have the capability to dive into some of those issues, dive into viruses, dive into environmental change, dive into genetic analysis, some of these other topics that are hot topics of today. Okay? So this introductory lecture is really to just go over the bottom, the baseline, the background of what we consider biology. Okay, so biology is the study of living things or living organisms. We're going to go into a little bit on what determines if something's alive. We know that living things on this planet are diverse. In fact, we don't even really have a good grasp on the diversity that we have on this earth. We know that we're losing species at an alarming rate, but we also know that we have a lot to do before we can name and classify every organism on the planet. Quite frankly, most scientists believe that we'll never be able to name every organism on the planet. But we can do a better job than what we've done thus far. We've named just over 1.5 million species. And most scientists would agree that we maybe have hit the 10% mark. So we maybe have identified 10% of the species. So there's somewhere around 10 million species on the planet. There's other estimates of maybe we've only named 1% of the species, and there's more like 100 million species on the planet. Okay? Now, some of this comes with techniques. Prior to the modernization of genetics and the discovery of genetic analysis, prior to that, most species were just identified by physical characters. Okay? And those physical characters, if species look different, really different, or they have different reproductive parts or different structures that you can base your analysis on, then you can probably conclude that they're different species. But that being said, just because they look different doesn't necessarily mean that they're different species. Along came genetic analysis that really allowed us to check ourselves on that morphology data, morphology meaning physical characters, that morphology data and whether or not they were actually different species. Sometimes, indeed, we were right. Other times, no, we weren't, and that they were just a different morphology or different form of the same species. Now, as we progress with genetic analysis, the hopes by a lot of scientists, systematists, individuals who are looking at naming of organisms and classifying organisms, the hope is that our genetic techniques get so good that we can, instead of analyzing a single species at a time, we can analyze massive amounts of species and get data on those species at the exact same time. So, in other words, being able to take a water sample and pour it through a filter system, collect all the living organisms, and then genetically analyze all those living organisms at the exact same time. And picking out the individual genetic codes, classifying those genetic codes as different species if they are. That would allow us to save a massive amount of time and classify a lot of species in a given sample. We're not quite there yet. Okay? But we're moving in that direction. And a lot of the species that are left to classify are not mammals and birds and amphibians and reptiles. And really, they're not even fish. Most of the species that are left to classify fall into the insects, some small, minute plants, some fungi, a lot of protista, okay? A lot of bacteria, probably by far the most species-rich group that we have not classified, and then quite a few archaea also. So with that, a lot of the species to come are going to be minute, microscopic organisms. Not to take anything away from the relevancy of that work, it's just most of the things that you could classify by morphology has already been classified. Okay. We'll dive into this more when we start talking about evolution, and we'll start talking about how species are named and things like that. Okay, so after you've named an organism, a lot of times, because we want science, especially biology, to be universal, we want individuals in different countries to be able to know that information, to be able to use that information. These species have to be classified in a uniform way. And part of that uniform way is dividing them up into kingdoms. And we'll come back to this in a second. Kingdoms itself, there are 6 kingdoms currently. Kingdoms itself really leads to grouping of organisms that have different traits, and they are uniform different traits. So every single organism in a single group will have a certain characteristic, and no other individuals outside of that group will have that characteristic. And that's kind of how the kingdoms have been devised. So there are 6 kingdoms of life, like I said before. Now that could change. Okay? It has changed in the past, and there's nothing to say it won't change in the future. Okay? But currently the 6 kingdoms are archaea and bacteria. Now those archaea and bacteria make up a group called prokaryotes, okay? Which means they do not have a nuclei. Okay? So prokaryotes don't have a nuclei and they don't have organelles. And we'll come back to this when we start talking about cells. Okay? If that's not a familiar concept to you, we'll cover it again. Okay? But they make up a group called the prokaryotes. They also happen to be in their own domain, each one of them. So archaea, which is the kingdom, is also archaea, the domain. Bacteria, which is a kingdom, is also bacteria, the domain. Okay? Now, domains are even a more broad, overarching classification. Okay? And it's dividing groups based on their evolutionary characteristics, how they evolved, when they evolved, and then some physical characters that keep them in these groups. Okay? Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. Okay? These 4 belong to a group called eukarya, or eukaryotes. That is their domain. Okay? And so from that standpoint, if prokaryotes mean they have no nucleus and no organelles, eukaryotes mean they have a nucleus and they have organelles. So again, protista, fungi, planta, and animalia. Of course, most people are familiar with animals and plants and fungi. Protista are often unicellular organisms that occur in aquatic systems. Not always, okay, but we'll cover some protista and we'll examine kind of their systems. And you can have protista that are animal-like, where they are heterotrophs and they consume food. You can have protista that are plant-like, where they're doing photosynthesis and they're creating their own food, called autotrophs. Okay? And so protista is kind of a catch-all of microorganisms that have nuclei. And we'll come back to that classification in the future. All right, so that brings us to this: biology is the study of life. Well, we kind of need to define what it means to be alive. Okay? So that question should, be at the forefront of your mind when we start talking about life. What does life mean to you? Okay? What does something living, or what would you describe as something living, okay, versus something non-living? In the past, these kind of points have always been considered, and maybe you're considering them as you're watching this lecture, and that would be complexity. Okay? So, do living organisms, do they have to be complex? Do they have to be more complex than non-living organisms? Okay, where's the complexity? What do you have to have from a complexity point of view? What do you have to have in order to be considered alive? Movement. Okay? Does the organism have to be able to move? And a lot of you might be thinking of this and saying, well, yeah, no, trees don't have to move and they're alive. Yeah, okay. Now that is like physical, visual movement that you can physically see. Okay? But trees aren't doing that. But at the cellular level, are they moving? Yeah, they are. So is movement important as a life property? Maybe. Come back to it. Okay? Response to stimuli. Does everything that respond to stimuli, is it alive? Well, I'd probably have to say no. I mean, you can use the touch screen on your phone to respond to stimuli. There's temperature sensors that respond to stimuli, motion sensors that respond to stimuli. There's a lot of man-made computer stuff, okay, or electronics that respond to stimuli, but we would consider them not alive. So does everything have to respond to stimuli that's alive? Maybe. Okay. Now the key component, just like we were talking about when we're talking about putting things in kingdoms, they must be exclusive. Okay? So if we're going to define life, it has to be exclusive properties. Everything must fit those properties. So let's look at the properties of life. The first property is cellular organization. Okay? As far as we know, as far as humans on the planet Earth know, our definition of life has to mean that that organism has to have a cell. Okay? It doesn't have to have multiple cells. It can be single-celled, okay? But it must have at least one cell. Okay? The second property of life, it must have a metabolism. Okay? And how that metabolism works can differ by organism for sure, but all organisms, all living things, must process energy and use that energy to drive other processes. Now, we talked about two examples already. I mentioned two words already. Autotrophs. Autotrophs, they utilize sunlight, most of them. Okay? Utilize sunlight to develop energy, okay? Not create energy, but form energy. So they use the photons as a spark or as a initial source of energy to combine molecules to make chemical energy. Okay? We call that photosynthesis, if it's using photons or light. Okay? There's another form of autotrophy, which we call chemosynthesis. That's when chemicals are involved, okay, not light. So chemicals are combined or chemicals are broken. Okay, the energy from that breaking or combination is utilized to then form other products, more stable products in many cases, or more user-friendly products for the organism that's doing the chemosynthesis. Okay. And then, of course, there's heterotrophs, and those are organisms that consume autotrophs, and that's how they get their energy. Okay? But regardless of whether you're making your own energy or you're consuming energy that something else made, you have a metabolism. You have a ability to process that energy. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is often confused or has kind of a confusing connotation because we think of homeostasis from a human standpoint and only a human standpoint. Okay? So homeostasis is the ability to maintain optimized conditions, okay? Or maintain stable internal conditions. Okay? When we often think about it from a human standpoint, temperature comes to mind often, and we think about, okay, temperature is a homeostasis or an example of homeostasis. We maintain the body temperature of 98.6, give or take a degree. Okay? But if you creep 5 degrees above 98.6, you could be in a world of hurt. Your proteins will start to denature. Okay? If you go below 98.6 by 5 degrees, you could be in an extreme world of hurt. Okay, so we think about it from a human perspective when we think about homeostasis, but we need to get out of that mindset and realize there are a lot of organisms out there, especially around temperature, salinity, okay, how much precipitation or how much water that organism has, different homeostasis events that these organisms have the capability of having much wider optimization. Right? Take reptiles, amphibians, insects, fish, all these organisms maintain a body temperature based on their environment. Right, so if it's 70 degrees in the water, the fish's temperature is 70 degrees. Right? If that water cools off to 35 degrees, okay, that fish's temperature is going to get pretty close to that 35 degree mark. If it warms up to 80, 90, okay, that fish's temperature can get up into that 80, 90 degree mark. Now, as you get to those extremes, is it harmful for the fish? Absolutely. But their range is much wider than our range as humans. And so they maintain a temperature based on their environment. So by thinking about homeostasis in a holistic, all-organism point of view, okay, we're not talking about, when we talk about stable, we're not talking about a single value. We're talking about a range. It just happens to be our values are often very, very small ranges and, many times singular. Okay? But other organisms might have a range that is much larger than ours, but it's still stable until they get outside of those. Okay? Growth and reproduction. The organism must be able to grow and reproduce. Okay? Now, growth can look in many different ways. It doesn't mean that you have to get large. Growth could just mean that you have the capability of dividing yourself have the capability of expanding a cell membrane, have the capability of producing reproductive parts. Okay? So growth can look very different in different organisms. Okay? And heredity. Okay? You must be able to pass on genetic information from one individual to the next, to their offspring. Right, now that offspring does not have to be genetically different than the parent. Okay? There's lots of organisms that produce just clones of themselves. They're still alive. They're still passing on genetic information to the next individual. It's just not changed genetic information. We'll look at this. Okay? The other thing is, notice that heredity doesn't say you have to be able to pass DNA on to the next generation. Okay? We know living organisms, some living organisms that don't have DNA and they have RNA, and that's what they pass on, is RNA. So you just have to be able to pass on genetic information. Okay? It doesn't mean it's a certain type of genetic information or a certain way that you pass it on. Okay? All right, so that's kind of the 5 items that make something alive. Now let's talk about some things that the study of life or the study of a biology, let's talk about some themes that all fields of biology, at many times, they are diving into these different themes, or these different themes play an important role in that field of biology. Okay? So there are really 5 biological themes. So there are 5 things that make something alive. There's 5 biological themes that all of biology concentrate on, I guess, or are the building blocks to the biology. The first one is evolution. Okay? Again, biology is the study of life. Evolution is defined as genetic change in a species over time. But better than a species over time, genetic change in a population over time is a better definition. So if we're talking about biological themes, we're talking about evolution or that change, even if we're talking about photosynthesis, or we're talking about cellular respiration, we're talking about viruses, we're talking about environmental change in the form of pollution or global climate change. We still talk about evolution. And we talk about how are species adapting to these changes. How does our body react to viral infections, and how are we evolving? Okay? How have we evolved from previous viral infections? Okay? All these things, really, evolution is kind of that background or that biological theme that we have to concentrate on. Okay? Now, often Charles Darwin is brought up when we talk about evolution, and for good reason, but I just want to make sure that some of the misconceptions are cleared up. Charles Darwin did not invent evolution. No one invented evolution. Evolution was discovered, okay? And evolution wasn't discovered by Charles Darwin. Evolution was discovered way before Charles Darwin. Lots of scientists had discovered that species change over time. Okay? Now, the genetics piece, Charles Darwin didn't even know the genetics piece, but he knew that species or populations can change over time. So did lots of other biologists prior to him, and they, even his grandfather used the term evolution. So he didn't even coin the term evolution. But what Charles Darwin did that none of the other scientists did before him is he came up with a mechanism, which he calls natural selection. Okay? He came up with a mechanism for which evolution can occur. Now, prior to him, there was lots of scientists, biologists that tried to put forth a mechanism. And those mechanisms, Lamarckian evolution, these mechanisms might have stayed around for a little bit of time, but once they were tested with a scientific method, which we'll get to, they fell apart. Now, one of the key components of natural selection is when you test it with the scientific method, and it's been tested thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of times, it's never been rejected. It's never been not supported. We're talking almost 250 years of scientific research about natural selection. Different studies, different people, different places, never been rejected, and does nothing but support natural selection. So that mechanism is very important and has stood up for a very long time. Darwin had other mechanisms that he developed. Sexual selection, artificial selection. Okay? These are other types of selection, other mechanisms for evolution. We'll discuss these when we get to evolution. Okay? We know now, after many, many years of research and scrutiny about evolution and about the concepts of evolution, we now know, with advances in genetics and other fields, we now know that the diversity of life, the 100 million, 10 million species on this planet, is a result, the direct result of evolutionary processes. A new species, if it is to form, okay, to develop, it's the result of evolutionary process. The flow of energy. So energy flows through a system. We already talked about this. This is one of the key components of something being alive. All living things have to have energy. They require some source of energy. So we'll talk about, when we talk about systems, we talk about viruses. Well, how do they get their energy? What do they do? How does your immune system get its energy? Where's the flow of energy? We'll talk about genetics. We'll talk about, again, environmental change. Where's the energy for the environment? What's missing? Okay? What does global climate change do to the energy of that ecosystem? Okay? We'll look at these components. Okay? Like I said before, probably 99% of the examples of flow of energy are going to come from photosynthesis. It comes from the solar energy, okay, and the utilization of the photons coming from the sun. That other 1% is chemosynthesis. We will talk about some examples of it, but by and large, most of the examples come from photosynthesis. Okay? We talked about this a little bit. Organisms can acquire energy differently. Okay? You can be an autotroph, heterotroph. Okay? If you're a heterotroph, there's lots of different ways to do this. Even if you're an autotroph, there's quite a few different ways to obtain energy. And one of the key components when we start talking about ecology is this energy cycle. How much energy is there for the next organism? Okay? So if you're a plant, you're absorbing photons, you're creating glucose and starch and other sugar molecules, and then you're eaten by the next organism up the food pyramid. Okay? Well, how much energy is actually available for that next organism up? We'll look into this. Okay? And then that organism gets consumed, and how much energy is available for that organism. And once you get to the top, okay, we're sitting at the top often, okay, or there's an apex predator at the top, sitting at the top, and how much energy is available for those organisms. And if those organisms just eat at the pyramid right below them, the piece of the pyramid right below them, we can calculate how much energy is available. Okay? Now, if they're like us and we eat at every level of the pyramid, okay, then it's a little more difficult to see how much energy is available. but we can see how much energy is available at each level, and we might talk about consuming the base level more because that's where more energy is available. Okay? We'll come back to that when we start talking about ecology, food webs, food pyramids, etc. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and then we're going to return and we'll talk about the third biological theme.